Well, hello there. We all have authors that we absolutely love. We've gone into all their books and just thoroughly enjoyed them, for the most part anyway. Today, I'm going to talk about how I discovered some of the authors or books, that series that I have enjoyed most, even if some of them aren't quite as enjoyable for me as they used to. But stay tuned, that's coming right up here on Drew's Book Reviews. Good day, and welcome. Let's talk about some of my favorite authors and how I got into my journey of discovery to some of my favorite writers. But before we get into that, don't forget to hit that like button, comment, and subscribe. You know the routine. All my links will be down below, so make sure you go and check that out. And of course, I would love to hear from you on how you might have discovered some of your favorite authors. So my story begins back in junior high and middle school when I was obsessed with Star Trek. Yep, I was obsessed with Star Trek. I've said it before on this channel. If you've never been here before, now you know. But yes, Star Trek. So in junior high, I had a teacher by the name of Miss Duff. Miss Duff was one of those English teachers that really wanted to inspire the students in her class to read and to grow through reading and just to discover all these awesome books that we have out there. But me, I always defaulted and I had to read my Star Trek book because I didn't like reading at the time. So when I was told I had to do a book report and I could pick a book, naturally I did a Star Trek book report. Miss Duff was okay with this for the first one, but by the second and third one and fourth one, she got a little bit tired of Star Trek book reports. So she said to me that from that point forward, I am not allowed to do a Star Trek book report. And this is what eventually led me to discover the first in this list of authors that I've come to absolutely love. And of course, what is a sci-fi nerd like me going to do? I'm not allowed to read Star Trek. Well, darn it, fine. I'm going to read something set in space, right? So of course, I had to pick up another spaceship battle themed alien type book. And I picked up The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. I didn't know anything about this series at all. I only knew that I couldn't read Star Trek for my book reports for school. So I picked up The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and I was laughing constantly from start to finish. It was crazy, just absolutely insane and crazy. I was loving every moment of it. My mind was blown. There's actually good science fiction out there that isn't Star Trek. I was like, wow, there's a whole new universe literally for me to discover after I picked up The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, this story in and of itself is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, come on, Earth is being demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass, and our main character, Arthur Dent, basically has to hitchhike a ride on an alien spaceship across the galaxy only to discover everything in the universe is not what he thinks it is, and they're in search for the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. I mean, it's just a crazy story, but my mind was blown. I realized that there was so much good writing out there in science fiction or otherwise. And that's how I discovered Douglas Adams, because I was basically told I'm not allowed to read another Star Trek book. And I am so grateful to the late Ms. Duff for getting me to read something other than Star Trek and branching out in the universe in science fiction. So of course Ms. Duff was starting to notice a trend, and naturally she's like, alright, I said no more Star Trek book reports because I really want you to branch out beyond like the standard sci-fi spaceship alien type stuff. You need something more. There's so much good writing out there. So I was told by my teacher, Miss Duff, that my next book report better be on something that is not space and alien related. She didn't say it couldn't be science fiction though, only that it couldn't be set in space with aliens, and I had to find something different to pick up and learn from. And that is how I discovered the next author on this list. And I was browsing through the library trying to find something that was science fiction that maybe would fit the criteria that was put down for me to read and branch out beyond that. And I discovered a book called The Terminal Man. Now, The Terminal Man is by Michael Crichton. And what's really interesting about this book is that it captivated me so incredibly well. what fascinated me about the Terminal Man itself was that the character suffered from something that I had also been suffering with, and that was epilepsy. He had these extreme seizures, and the whole point, or the whole story behind Terminal Man, was about him undergoing this brain surgery to stop it by implanting these electrodes in his brain. But he was able to take control of this somehow and stimulate the pleasure centers of his brain, causing him to, well, become terminal. Just now, granted, the type of seizures that our main character in Terminal Man has are not anywhere close or anything like the kind that I dealt with, but the fact that he was having these seizures, and I thought, wait a minute, I have seizures. I grew up with epilepsy. And so I found I suddenly connected with a character that wasn't set in space and was in a sci-fi techno thriller, which is kind of its own genre in and of itself. And suddenly I realized that there's more than just space setting science fiction out there. I mean, a lot of space setting science fiction is really good. I mean, we also have The Expanse and The Dune, of course. But I realized that Michael Crichton was in fact a fantastic writer and had me hooked. Next thing you know, I'm reading all of his books. There's the Andromeda Strain, of course, and then there's Sphere and the classics of Jurassic Park. And these are just a few of his books that I have, of course. State of Fear. Next, Timeline, about time travel. And I just started picking up all of his books. I've read every single one that he has. I've got, of course, a lot more than just these ones on my shelf specifically. But I've read everything that Michael Crichton has ever written. And I just became so hooked and in love with his writing. One of these days, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do a whole reread of his entire catalog. I think that would be a lot of fun, and I probably should do it at some point because it's actually been a while. As we know, Michael Crichton has passed away. He is no longer with us, so we don't expect to see any more of his books coming out. But I was hooked on Michael Crichton. I loved every book of his, and I just couldn't devour his books quick enough. And I absolutely loved it. Eventually, after this experience, I started to recognize, of course, that there's lots of really great books out there all over. And this kind of led me to some other books as well. And I did eventually get into some more space books, of course. And I actually had a friend of mine who told me that he thought I would really enjoy a particular book by Orson Scott Card. Now, to put this out there, I'm not as much a fan of Orson Scott Card as I used to be. This is a book series I will never reread, and I did go ahead and unhaul all my Orson Scott Card books just because my personal opinion of his writing and the politics and philosophy he puts into his books has changed a lot over the years, but I will always have fond memories of reading Ender's Game. And I still would consider Orson Scott Card as one of my favorite science fiction writers, simply because of the memories and I've had of reading the Ender's Game series and how much I love that series. And I fear to ever reread it because I know how my tastes on Orson Scott Card have changed so much over the years, and he's not an author that I would say that his later works were nearly as enjoyable, but Ender's Game will still always have fond memories for me. And I love the idea and the story behind the Formic Wars and this kid, genius, trained from childhood for the sole purpose of defeating this threat to humanity's extinction. And I think it's just overall was a really good read and fond memories of reading it. I don't think I ever want to ruin that by rereading, because at this point I do fear rereading this series and it being just not feeling the same for me anymore, as it's already happened with one series. So as I began branching out and reading more genres of books and getting more into not just science fiction but fantasy as well, I was at a bookstore one day, and I don't quite remember when I first picked this series up, to be honest, but I do remember that I had purchased this book, not realizing it was part of a bigger fantasy series. And it's an author I never heard of before. I've never tried reading any of their books before. And while, again, this is one of those authors where my tastes have changed, I find I'm not enjoying the series as much as I used to, but I still enjoy it. I'll say probably still more than I enjoy Orson Scott Card's writing now, as I haven't unhauled any of this. That's to be determined though. But anyway, I'll stop beating around the bush. I picked up a book by Terry Goodkind called Blood of the Fold. Now, I didn't realize at the time that I picked this book up that it was actually part of a bigger fantasy series, and it was partway into the series. I had no idea. I just saw the dragon on the cover and I thought, cool, dragons. Dragons are cool. this is probably going to be a good book, I bet. Then I found out it was part of the series, so of course I had to go and pick up the rest of the Sword of Truth series before I could actually start reading this series. And at the time that I first read it, it was a series I was really starting to love and fall in love with. I love the characters of Richard and Kaelin and Kara. I even named two of my kids, Kaelin and Kara. So this was a series that I had read and just fell in love with. I'd read this series after my first daughter was born, so probably she would have been named after one of the characters if I'd read it before. All I know is at some point after my first daughter was born when I picked that up. This is when I really started branching out and really getting into the fantasy realm, at least from my memory. But we all know memory's not perfect. But anyway, the point is, this is where I really started to pick up more fantasy books. And when I read Sword of Truth series, all because I picked up the third book to begin with, this really got me hooked on epic fantasy and the idea behind epic fantasy and what could be done with epic grand scope fantasy, which I absolutely loved. And this eventually, of course, led into reading more epic fantasy and picking up more of these fantasy type books. So one day I ended up picking up another epic fantasy series that I kind of started to hear a little bit about, but didn't know a whole lot about and didn't know anything about it at all. Again, another author I'd never really heard of. And that was Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time. Well, I had loved the first epic fantasy series I read. Why not check out another one? So I picked up The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. And this is when my love for epic fantasy really started to blossom and grow and become a big thing. Like with science fiction, I started to realize that there are some really great writers and really great stories to be told in the epic fantasy worlds that are created. And so I read Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, and I just started powering through them, and I fell in love with the characters, with Rand and Perrin and Nynaeve and Moraine and Egwene and Matt and all of them, and I just started falling in love with these characters. They were just amazing. I fell in love with this world, and I just kept reading and reading, and then we got to the end of the series, which I noticed had been written by a different author. So of course, as I get to the end of the Wheel of Time series, I discovered that this series is written by some guy I had never heard of in my life. Brandon Sanderson? I don't know who this guy is. At that time, I just thought saw he finished it, and I thought, okay, some no-name guy. I have no idea who this Sanderson guy is. Never even heard of him, except when he's finishing the Wheel of Time. So of course, I started thinking to myself, well, if this Brandon Sanderson guy is good enough to finish the Wheel of Time, then he must be a pretty decent author, right? I mean, Robert Jordan wouldn't just let anybody finish his book series. It'd have to be someone with skill and talent and has proven himself, right? But I'd never heard of this Brandon Sanderson guy. So I decided that if Brandon Sanderson was good enough to finish the Wheel of Time, he must have something worth reading. And so I started looking around to see what he had wrote. Now, I'm pretty sure Elantris was the first book by Brandon Sanderson I read. I'm not 100% positive on that, but I'm pretty sure it was Elantris. Might have been Warbreaker, could have been Mistborn. One of those three, but I'm pretty sure it was Elantris. And so I picked up Elantris, and I just got hooked on Elantris, hooked on Brandon Sanderson. I thought, wow, this guy's pretty good. And I started devouring everything that Brandon Sanderson had written. And the funny thing is, at the time, I had no idea that Elantris was actually part of a bigger universe, the Cosmere. I didn't have a clue about the Cosmere. I had no idea what that was. Honestly, it wasn't until I started getting into Mistborn, after I'd read Warbreaker and then Mistborn, that I started to learn more about the Cosmere. I mean, I was in the middle of Mistborn on my first read ever through it, and I had no idea about the Cosmere at that point. I didn't realize that these worlds were connected. But then, as I started to learn more about the Cosmere and learn how that they were connected, mind blown. I was loving it. I was loving this bigger universe that Sanderson had created. I started loving the Cosmere, and I had to devour everything I could get my hands on for Brandon Sanderson. So of course now I've got the whole collection up here, as much Sanderson as I can manage to find, and of course Stormlight Archive becoming one of my favorite series of all time, easily my favorite of all time. The Cosmere on its own, if you count it as a single series, is absolutely my favorite series of all time. And so I started reading everything, and of course I got the Secret Project books here, I've got the White Sands, all my other Sanderson all along here. And I just started absolutely loving everything Brandon Sanderson had written. And that is how I got into Brandon Sanderson, because he finished The Wheel of Time. And at the time, as far as I was concerned, he was some no-name author I'd never heard of. Now he's one of the biggest fantasy authors that are out there. And I don't know if it was him finishing The Wheel of Time that did that or what, but all I know is now I love Brandon Sanderson. So that is how I got into some of my favorite authors of all time. That was my journey to discovering the broader world of all that science fiction and fantasy has to offer. This is by no means a comprehensive list of my favorite authors. There are just too many to choose from when it comes to checking out the writing. I mean, we have Evan Winter is certainly in there. Margaret Atwood is another author that I've really enjoyed. Robin Hobb is another author that I've really enjoyed. So far, I've only read a few books by Robin Hobb, so definitely is going to be up there with some of my favorite writers and favorite fantasy of all time for sure. But I just wanted to pick these authors specifically because I think how I got into them was quite unique and different than how I had discovered a lot of other authors, which so much of what I read now I discovered through BookTube and hearing recommendations, rather than one just kind of gradually leading to the next and just kind of trying to figure out on my own. So these are the authors that really got me into science fiction and fantasy from the start. And there's so many, Frank Herbert with Dune. Like, there are so many authors out there that I could have made a whole list. This video would probably be an hour long if that were the case. But those are just some of my thoughts on some of the authors that got me into science fiction and fantasy and how that happened. So let me know in the comments down below, what are some of your favorite authors? How did you discover them? Join me over on Discord. Follow me on Threads and Instagram. I've got all that linked down below. Join me on Hardcover. I'll have that link below as well. And I do want to thank you so much for watching today. Thank you so much for commenting. Thank you for just being here. Thank you all to my subscribers. I do appreciate it. And I hope that you've had a wonderful day, that you are having a wonderful time discovering authors and their amazing stories that they have to tell us. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep on reading. Bye!